Kyla and welcome back to the Infinite Library. So today I'm going to do my January wrap-up, which is probably going to be quite a short video to be honest, because I didn't get through that many books in January. I feel like this happened last year in January too, and the start of the year is just so busy with everything else going on that I think it's sometimes hard to prioritize like reading a lot, and sometimes you're also just not in the mood at that time of year because everything is in that weird, like, it's the start of the new year and there's a million other things to do and that kind of thing. So I did only manage to read 6 books in January. I say only, I know for like some people that's a lot, given like my average has been about like 10 books or something a month towards the end of last year. I was hoping to get through a few more, but it just wasn't really working this month with that. But one of those books was a really chunky one, so, you know, I kind of was worried that was going to be like the only thing I read that month, and thankfully that wasn't the case. I did manage to read some other books as well. I'm also actually still in the middle of 3 books at the moment, so even though I've like read 6 books, I'm partway through 3 others that I was reading in January, and they are 3 books that were either kind of quite long, a buddy read, and then the other one was one that I actually started early. I was going to read it in February, but I ended up starting it a little bit early because I was just at the right time to read it, essentially, because I was doing a lot of travelling. So, to summarise the rest of the stats for the month, I read 3,268 pages. Of the 6 books that I read, format-wise, I read 5 of them physically and 1 via audio. And this is finally me starting to try audiobooks, and I actually had a really good experience with it, which I'll explain when I get to me reviewing that specific book. But it's definitely something I'm going to try a little bit more in future, and I think honestly if I hadn't have read this specific book via audio, then I probably wouldn't have even got to many other books this month, so it definitely did work for me this month. Genre-wise, of the 6 books that I read, not the books that I'm currently still in the middle of, I read 4 fantasy, 1 historical book, and 1 manga. And the source of these books, 4 of those books was from my existing TBR. 1 was a book that I'd borrowed from a friend, and the other was a book that I'd bought this month, and I read it this month, basically. Star rating wise, I had thankfully no 0 stars. No, 1 stars, sorry. I had 1 2-star read, unfortunately, but no 3-star books. 4 4-stars and 1 5-star. So that gives me an average rating overall of 4.08, which is pretty damn good. I'm kind of sad about that 2-star book because it was a book that I was really hoping was gonna be like a 4 or a 5 for me, but I had no 3-star reads, which I feel like I predominantly have a lot of 3-star reads. So the fact that all the other books were in like the 4 and 5 category is brilliant. So I did thankfully like quite enjoy most of the books that I read throughout this month. So I will go over the 6 books that I read now in order of when I read them. One of them I don't have a physical copy of anymore, so I'll just kind of put a graphic up for that. It was the 2-star, so I read it and I left it for somebody else to read, basically, because I'm like, I'm done, I'm not going to reread this. So I started off the month with something quite short and sweet, and that is a manga called Snow Fairy by, hang on, it's the other way around apparently, Tomo Sarazawa. And this is just like it's just like a 1 volume kind of thing rather than it being a series. But it's just this like really kind of sweet, cute little BL manga about these 2 guys. One of them who lives in this like remote village, and it's set during the winter, obviously. He lives in this remote village. He basically rescues this guy who's been out in the snow for too long, and it turns out this guy is like this famous wildlife photographer, and he's been like basically like lost track of time because he was trying to take photos of various creatures that he found, and he ends up like reluctantly at first taking him in, and the 2 just start forming this bond, and like the photographer's trying to like, he's staying for over the winter with him because he's trying to find this elusive like snow fairy, and the guy like doesn't really know what he means by a snow fairy. I'm not going to spoil what it is, but it's really cute. But yeah, it was just really sweet, really wholesome. I really liked it. There was a lot about sort of consent and intimacy. It was really well handled, I think. Like how even just the small things of like just being near somebody and loneliness can mean so much to somebody. So yeah, I really recommend this one if you want something that's just kind of short, cute, wholesome. It really did fit the bill, and it was a really nice start to the month just to read something that was just kind of sweet. So yeah, that was the manga that I read this month. I then read the chonka, which was Priory the Orange Tree. So this was for my book club, but it also kind of counts as a rainy day book because I feel like if it hadn't have got picked for my book club, it probably would have sat on my shelves for a long time because it's big. It is like, I mean, you probably know what this book is already, but it's like over 800 pages, and it is an epic fantasy with like a sapphic relationship in it as well. And it's all kind of based in this like fantasy land with these different lands, sorry. And these dragons are like a big focal point of it. And the story is told through 4 different narrators throughout the book, although one narrator, Iad, is kind of like the main focal point narrator, I'd say. So I really, really was hoping it was going to be a 5-star for me. You know, it's got so much hype. It's beloved by so many people. I've been wanting to try Samantha Shannon for a really long time, but it just wasn't quite that for me. It was still a solid read, I'd say. It was like a 4-star is what I gave it in the end. But funnily enough, like the other people in the book club actually had a similar experience to me. Like a lot of them wasn't even that keen on it. And I think that this is kind of the issue with books when they're overhyped, I think. And I think a lot of people were really excited to read it. And then they read it and they just didn't like it as much as they thought they were going to. So like I had maybe like, not everyone was able to read this one for it because it is so chunky, but I think there was still like 7 of us that read this book. And of those 7, I think there was one person that really loved it. I really liked it, and everyone else was just kind of not really loving it, unfortunately. But yeah, it's a shame because I really wanted to love it. But I think for me, the issue is that I am someone who has to connect with the characters to really get super involved into a story, and it took me, I just didn't. Is the thing, like with the 4 different narrators, like I didn't think that was a major issue initially, but I really was struggling to get invested in the characters and so also the story. I think the only character I did end up like quite liking and getting more invested in was Iad, who was thankfully like one of the main focal narrators. But of the 3 other narrators, I just wasn't keen on any of them, to be honest. Like there was Arteloff, who was like this noble guy, this noble lord, and he was just kind of boring. Like I really wanted to like him, but I feel like he was only ever used in the story as kind of like a plot device to like get something from somewhere to something else, or he was just being a messenger a lot of the time. He didn't really have much of like a journey in himself. And other people were sort of, they mentioned that he must be having this like personal journey going on because there's this whole thing where like his religion is challenged and he's having to like perform these tasks even though it is like the opposite of what he believes in. And people are like saying like, oh, he must be struggling with that. And we never really saw it, which was kind of a shame because I think that would have been so much better, and I think I would have liked his character a lot more if we'd been more with him in like his head to see that, but we just didn't see that, unfortunately. So I didn't hate him. He was just fine, basically. Like I just didn't ever was that super interested in him or invested in him, unfortunately. Of the other 2 characters, there's Nicolaes, who is this kind of like elderly alchemist who ends up getting caught up and makes a ton of bad decisions. I really wanted to like him. I think he's probably second after Iad of the characters that I like in terms of how invested I got in them. And I wanted to like him. I found him as a person and his history like super interesting, but he was just so frustrating as a character. Like he'd keep making these bad decisions and you'd just be like, no, Nicolaes, what are you doing? This is just making things worse for everyone. And he does kind of, you know, eventually sort of come around to doing what is more the right thing, but it's just such a frustrating character arc and it just felt very rushed towards the end. And yeah, unfortunately that just meant that I didn't really like him that much either. And then the final character, Tane, she just annoyed me. Like I really wanted to like her. Like she is kind of like the dragon rider in the book, And there is so much about her that could be really interesting. Like, again, it's that thing of like, it's so interesting on paper, but in the book, I didn't really like her at all. Like, I didn't like the decision she made. I found her quite irritating whenever she was talking about other people. Any sort of like relationships she had, which wasn't many. I think there was just like with her dragon and then with her mentor. They were so rushed that I didn't really get any sense of her developing as a character throughout it, and I think that would have benefited her so much. Like, especially, that was one of my other complaints about this book, is that for a book that is so centered around dragons, there are so little dragons in this book. Like, we get some dragons and they're talked about a lot, but we don't really see dragons very much, even though one of the dragons is like the dragon that is Tane's dragon. And I know that there are reasons why we don't see as much of this dragon, but even so, like, it does this thing where it kind of like tells you, not shows you. And it's just like, oh, you kind of have to assume from one chapter that they have this like, this deep bond of each other. And then it's gone and we don't see them again for ages. And it's just very frustrating because I really wanted to see more of that. So unfortunately, like, the issue I had with that is that it's such a long book, but the pacing was a bit off for me, and I feel like at times, particularly towards the end was super rushed. Like, it had this massive build-up for this big battle, and then the battle's over in like a couple of pages, and like the main villain is there for maybe like 2 pages and then is gone. It really felt like it could have been longer, which is not something I would have thought for an 800-page book, but it has this massive build-up and then it's gone so fast, and things happen so fast I actually had to reread it because I got confused. I was like, what just happened? Like, it's just done already? So it's just a bit disappointing towards the end. Like, I did enjoy this for a great portion of it, but the ending was quite disappointing. Not like the overall conclusion. I was happy with, like, mostly happy anyway, with like the conclusion right at the end, but just the build up to this big battle was just, it felt like just a waste, because again, it was just a case of it happened so fast that we didn't really get to be in it and feeling the stakes and feeling the danger. So it was just a bit disappointing in that regard, unfortunately. But overall, like, I sound like I'm like bashing this book, but I'm not. I genuinely did really like it. I probably am going to check out the prequel book, Day of Fallen Night, I think, because it's a different set of characters. And I think the main issue for me in this is that I wasn't invested enough in the characters to really love this book. But it's a different set of characters in the prequel book, and she writes gorgeously, don't get me wrong. Like, she has great world building, she writes gorgeously. I think just her pacing, her combat, and how she writes her characters could maybe use some work. So I'm hoping that, I mean, in terms of epic fantasy, I know this author's also written like an urban fantasy, which I do have the first book of, and I've heard people say that they like that more. So I am intrigued to like see her do something that maybe she's not so caught up in trying to create this big epic world, that maybe there'll be more focus on the characters. But I did like this world enough to want to kind of read something else in it. So whilst I'm not in a hurry to get to Day of Fallen Night, because it is longer than this one, I think, I will still check it out one day, I think, because I think it might like hit for me, whereas this book didn't quite hit for me, unfortunately. Oh, and Aralak, best boy, easily. So after reading that, I didn't say sorry, but I actually read Priory the Orange Tree mostly via audio. Like, I do obviously have the physical book, but I've discovered that sometimes like just seeing a physical book makes me read slower. Like, I really had that issue with Swordcatcher, and because I knew it was going to be long and I'd heard the audiobook was actually okay for this one, I decided to do it by audiobook. And honestly, it helped me so much. Like, I got through it so much faster than I think I would have done if I'd been reading it physically. I did still read some of it physically because I went back a couple of times and like checked a couple of things. And sometimes I did read a couple of chapters just physically, but I read it majority via audio, and the audio was really good for it. There was a couple of like wobbly narration moments. Like, I really didn't like how the narrator voiced the dragons because it was just kind of silly. But in general, it was a really good audiobook. I really liked that because there are so many characters. For me, getting to hear the names actually helped them stay in my head a little bit better, whereas I think I'd have lost them a little bit. within the book. So I definitely recommend the audio for this if that's something that you're interested in, because it really did help me get through this. And I managed to get through it in like just under 2 weeks, I think. And I think if I'd read it physically, it'd have been like the whole month and I may have gone to a slump with it. So yeah, really recommend that. But when I finished that, again, because it was a big epic fantasy and it disappointed me a bit, I wanted something that was just going to be light and breezy. So I then picked up The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. So I've had this on my shelves for a bit now, and I know because it's like a cozy fantasy kind of thing, but I also know it's like a romance. So I was a little wary going into it because I'm not always super into romances. But I really enjoyed this one. Like, honestly, this was literally what you call like a hug in a book. It was so cozy. I really loved the characters. The romance, thankfully, was like just enough that it wasn't the whole story, which is what I was worried about. Like, I was worried it was going to be mostly about the romance, but it really wasn't. So basically, it is about, what's her name? It's about this British witch called Mika Moon, and she ends up taking this job to look after a bunch of like not even teenagers, they're like younger, but like young witches, because there's this thing happening and they need to be learnt to like how to control their characters. So she ends up moving to kind of live with them and their guardians in Norwich. And it's just about her sort of like discovering herself a little bit more, realising like some of her past traumas and what it's like to belong with people. I really loved her relationship with the children. That was honestly like such a highlight for me. And all the side characters honestly were great. Like, I really wasn't that here for the romance, if I'm being honest. But it was just kind of fine, and thankfully it didn't like overtake the story to the amount that it was like the whole story. And I think the romance made sense because it was like a grumpy sunshine kind of thing, and he kind of like changed to because he saw things in her that made him realize where he went wrong, and he also like helped her get over some of her trauma. And yeah, I just really liked it. Like, it wasn't like groundbreaking or anything, but I gave it like a 4.25, I think, and I'll definitely pick up the next book when it comes out because it was just really nice, sweet read. And yeah, I just really liked it, basically. So next, I read what was one of my most anticipated books, not just of January, but the year, basically. And that was the sequel and finale to Divine Rivals, Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. And I love this so much. This was my 5-star of the month. I was really hoping it was still going to be as good as the first book. And I'd say the first book was maybe a little bit better just because I loved getting to know these characters and getting to know them, getting to know each other. I guess, like, I thought that was really good. I loved the overall story. And the story this one was trying to tell was actually quite different in that there are a lot higher stakes. The supernatural elements in the first book are a lot more downplayed. Like, we know there is a celestial war going on where it's like two gods that are pitted against each other and they are basically drafting people to come into their armies, and it goes a lot more into that in this book. So the stakes were much higher than what was going on in the first book. But these two characters, I just love them so much. I love them together so much. So it stomped on my heart a million times, and I thanked it for doing it. But I am so happy that this proved to be like such a great duology series, and I'm definitely going to check out more by this author. I can't say much more about it, honestly, because it is a sequel, but for me at least, you know, it was perfect. It was brilliant, and honestly, it was just everything I wanted from a finale. Like, there were a few things that I didn't quite like for example, there was sort of like the character arc of Iris's brother Forrest I wasn't crazy on because it felt like it was a very swift turnaround from what you got at the end of the first book. But otherwise, basically, yeah, I loved this. It's so good. It's definitely already one of my favourite books of the year. So yes, really happy that this had a good finale, and yeah, it's so good, and I love this series so much. The next book that I read was my buddy read that I was doing with Jules Gemharts, and we read Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This was so much better than I thought it was going to be. I've read a few of her books by Laini Taylor before. I started her oh my god, what's it called? Her Daughter is Smoke and Bone series, and I read the first 2 in that, and I loved the first one, I remember, didn't like the second one, haven't finished it, but it is something I'm going to try and do at some point this year. So I went in sort of a little bit iffy about if it was going to work for me or not, but it's a really different story, I think, in terms of what that is. That is more of an urban fantasy, which gets more epic, but this is straight up epic fantasy. And honestly, I'd forgotten how readable this author is. Like, she's so easy to read, and I really love the protagonist character in this, Laszlo. So for anyone that doesn't know what it's about, essentially it is about this this guy called Laszlo Strange, who has been kind of like obsessed with this like lost city, and he is a librarian, and he ends up sort of getting embroiled in some bigger things that's going on that involves him taking a journey to go find this city, essentially, and what he finds there is not what he expects. And he is like the character that I always think of as like, he's kind of like an anti-protagonist, in that there is another character in this who, by the way, I hated. He is who I think a lot of authors would have picked to be the protagonist. Like, he's the one kind of doing things, but I love that this author chose to make Laszlo the protagonist. Like, he is like the gentle person, the more introverted person. He's a librarian, you know, and he's a dreamer. Like, as it says, like, Strange the Dreamer is Laszlo Strange, and they call him a dreamer because his head is in the clouds all the time. But he's such a gentle character, and I found him to be so relatable. So I really enjoyed him as a character, and it really did just work for the whole story that's being told here. There was another character as well who I wasn't as keen, unfortunately, on the other main character in this, Sarai. I found her really interesting, but I just didn't connect with her as much as I did with Laszlo. But yeah, this book was a wild ride, honestly. Like, it really went in places I didn't think it was going to go. The ending, my god, was crazy. I've already got like the second book out from the library, and we're going to carry on and finish the series in March, I think, which is Muse of Nightmares. And I've heard mixed things about that. Like, I've heard some people who've loved this have not loved the sequel, but I'm really hoping it'll still be good. And I honestly have no idea where it's going to go, to be honest, because things really kicked off towards the end of this. And I am both excited and afraid to see where it's going to go from here. But, like, there's massive changes for Laszlo throughout the course of this book. And, yeah, I'm just really interested to see where it's going to go next. Yeah, there's a lot of like stuff with like moral quandaries and stuff as well, which I thought was really interesting. Like, it basically there's this whole like thing where it's like gods versus humans, and it's hard to know whose side you want to be on, because honestly you hear from both sides, and if I'm being honest, I'm more on the human side than the gods. So with how things happen, it's interesting, and I don't know how I'm going to feel about where it goes next, to be honest. But yeah, I found this to be, honestly, like, for an epic fantasy, it was a really easy read, and I really enjoyed it. I think it did start to drag a little bit in the middle, which is when sort of Sarai gets introduced and things slowed down a little bit because we've reached a certain location. But it did speed up again. So yeah, overall, I really liked this one. I think I gave it like a solid 4. This one was, like, really enjoyed it. It wasn't a 5 for me, but still really good read, and I'm looking forward to reading the sequel. So the last book that I read this month was what I got from my TBR jar, and that was A Little Stranger by Sarah Waters, which is a historical gothic novel, is what it's billed as, but honestly, it's more of a historical mystery, I'd say. Like, it definitely does have those gothic tropes, but for me personally, it didn't really delve into horror that much. Like, a lot of like the reviews on it on the back are like saying it's haunting and it's so scary, I can't sleep, and that was really not what I found this book to be, quite honestly. So this was not dreadful, but I have such high hopes with Sarah Waters because I love Tipping the Velvet and I love Fingersmith. I have both of those. And I want to read some others. I've seen the movie for Affinity, I believe. A TV special kind of thing, so I haven't read that one yet. But generally, I really love her writing style, and I love her stories and her characters. And this one just didn't work for me, unfortunately. Like, a lot of her books are sapphic historical novels, and this is a historical novel, but it's not sapphic. And I did not like the main character that much at all, unfortunately. Like, basically the story is about this like doctor who is gets embroiled in like this family who used to be really rich and really important, and now they've kind of like lost a lot of their money, and they're living in this decaying mansion and everything's falling apart, and there is something that's kind of haunting the mansion that they say is like a curse, and is like not happy about people coming into the mansion or leaving the mansion. Yeah, I mean, the writing was fine, honestly. Like, I don't think I ever felt like I was going to drop it, but I definitely could tell that I was losing interest as I was going in. And I did not like the romantic relationship. Like, I was really hoping it wasn't going to go in a romantic relationship, like, direction. And it did. And I really did not like the whole thing with that. Like, it made me really dislike the main character, because it's kind of like really obvious that he's like pursuing this woman and she's not interested in him, and he just doesn't get it. And oh no, there was some things that happened that I was really not happy about, and he was just really kind of embarrassing as a character. Like, I get that it was kind of realistic, and I did understand what he was going through, but he was just so like adamant that things were going to happen in a certain way, and he wasn't really taking her like feelings and views into account, to the point that like it was kind of obvious to me as the reader that she did not really want to marry him, and he was just like, yeah, we're getting married and life is going to be like this, and then some stuff happened basically that means things don't quite turn out as he wants them to be, and the ending was just kind of basically. Like, I didn't end up... The mystery was interesting, but I didn't really end up loving what was going with it. Apparently it's got a movie, which I did not expect. I don't know if the movie's any better. I don't think I'm that bothered in checking it out, to be honest. But maybe it does sort of like fix some of the issues that I had with that. It's a shame, because I liked the characters that were in the family a lot, but as the book went on, I just liked the main character, who was the doctor, less and less. So it wasn't a dreadful book. Like, I rated it was almost a 3, but I dropped it down to a 2.75 after I got to the ending. But yeah, unfortunately for me, like, I love Sarah Waters' books, but this one just was a miss for me, and I didn't enjoy it. And yeah, I'd say it was just more of a historical mystery than it was like a gothic horror kind of thing, which I think some people are sort of making it out to be. So yeah, that was a miss, unfortunately. So those are the 6 books I read in January. There are 3 other books that I am like currently still in the middle of. One of which is It, which I'm buddy reading. We are about 100 or so pages into this at the moment. I've just got past like the end of the prologue stuff, so we're about to start like all these stuff that happened in the past, and really enjoying this so far, honestly. Like, it's just really interesting. Like, I love the It films, so for me this is kind of like I'm watching the It films, but everything is so much more fleshed out, and I'm really enjoying getting to like learn all these things that were kind of brushed past really quickly in the movie. So yeah, really enjoying this. Excited to keep reading it. And I was reading Assassin's Apprentice, which is for Literary Diversion's Fits Along, and I took this with me at the end of the month when I was going away, and I read like half of it then. But I am filming this on the 4th of February, and I finished it now, so I'm not going to say anything about it because I'll put that in my February wrap-up. But yeah, so this one is already done, technically. And the final book that I have been sort of reading has actually been an audiobook. So after kind of trying an audio, and I realised obviously there's like a lot of like classics that are in the Audible library that you don't have to pay for, and one of them was The Count of Monte Cristo. And that is a book that's on my 12 Recs in 12 from last year that I never got to. And it's massive. It's like over 1,000 pages. And I've seen the movie. So I was like, I kind of do know the story of this. So I feel like reading, like listening to it slowly over time is probably something I can do, because I don't think it's a book that I would just read in one sitting, honestly. Like, especially now I've been listening to it, like I'm having like gaps and stuff and reading other stuff, and I don't think I'm missing stuff. So I'm currently about 200 pages into that book, and yeah, quite liking it so far. It's not like blowing me away, but I'm enjoying the process, and I'm really enjoying like listening to it, I think. So I don't know if I'll like finish that in February, because it is so long. It's just going to be something that I listen to on and off, I think, whenever I've got like, you know, dead time. If I'm like traveling or something, I don't have a book, I'll probably listen to it. So yeah, that's my other books that I've been reading. In terms of books that I didn't get to this month, I Didn't get to this, unfortunately. I had a suspicion as I was going through and I was just running out of time. So this did fall off my January TBR, and I will, with any luck, get to it in February because I am dying to get to it, but I'm also just dying to read so many other things. So yeah, hopefully I will get to this in February. But I did manage to read all the other books, including the TBR jar one, in the month, and I kind of got ahead of myself and read most of like one of my February books in Assassin's Apprentice. So those are all the books that I read in January. So the only thing that I really have left to do in this wrap up is review my bingo board. So this is from Literary Diversions, and I briefly showed this in, I think it probably would have been my TBR for January. But essentially, it is like a little bingo board, and I'm going to be trying to do this throughout the year to sort of help me hit some goals I want to hit. So I'm going to bring it up now, and we're going to go over together the squares and if I actually manage to make any progress on them. So the first one is a manga series. I'm going to say that's a no in this point because I am specifying a series, and whilst I did read a manga which is complete, it was 1 volume. So that is not going to be one that I complete in this month, unfortunately. Next we have read 50% of my 2024 purchases. I definitely did not do that. Ruthless Vows technically counts as a December purchase because it came in December, so that wasn't one of my 2024 purchases. And I have already purchased a couple of books, plus I've had some book box things come through. And I can confirm, I'm not going to tell you how many I've had because that's embarrassing, but I can confirm I've not read any of them. But a lot of them are on my TBR for February. So I will be probably getting through some of those in that month. Actually, I tell a lie. I am reading it at the moment, so I am technically reading one of them. But yeah, of the books that I've bought, I've not read any of them. So that square is still going to sit at 0%. 12 TBR veterans. Yes. I did read The Little Stranger. I've unfortunately on hold it now because it's not a book I'm going to keep, but it is what it is. But yeah, I can finally tick one off, and I've read one of my 12 TBR veterans. 10 horror or thriller books. Technically The Little Stranger is a thriller, but I see it as more of a mystery, so I'm not going to count it in this case. So I'm reading a horror currently with it, but again I've not finished it, so that's just going to be a blank still. I didn't do any random emoji reads. 10 sequels or books in a series, yes, because I read Ruthless Vows. So I'm not counting first books in the series, by the way, for this prompt. So the fact that I read Priory of the Orange Tree and Strange the Dreamer is not going to count, but I both finished and read a sequel with Ruthless Vows, so that is one that I've ticked off for that. Sci-fi, I didn't get to read any sci-fi. I really wanted to get to this like short one that was given to me for Christmas, but I just didn't have time, so that will hopefully be read at some point though. I didn't do anything with BFS controlling my TBR. That is something I'm gonna do in a future month, I think. And 10 rainy day books. Yes, because this is definitely a rainy day book. I hadn't had it for that long. I probably had it for about 3 months, but I know if I didn't have the push, I would not have read this. And it is a book I was anticipating being like something I was gonna really love, and I liked it. So, you know, it wasn't awful, but I'm gonna say that this is one of my 10 rainy day books. So that is it for my January wrap up. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay safe, stay cozy, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!